We definitely want to thank Prairie Lakes AEA for facilitating and suggesting this. It was Prairie Lakes AEA Chief Jeff Hersberg that I think was sending something out in the Twitterverse saying, hey, we're looking for some meaningful learning for educators in our area. And I just tweeted back with this random idea. Hey, there's a lot of books, there's a lot of workshops out there about how to get started with standards-based grading and why schools need to shift towards standards-based grading. But in Nathan and I's experience, there's not necessarily a lot out there for educators to take their next steps with standards-based grading. Like once they've got started, once they understand why we need to change grading practices, what are some of those common implementation pitfalls and challenges? And so that's really the focus of our time today, is overcoming common implementation pitfalls. And so we're going to go here for probably the next, hour and 15 minutes, something like that. Thank you to all of you. It sounds like everyone is well versed in the Zoom world, have your microphones muted, and some of you have your video cameras on. We're probably all well versed in the virtual world now. So thanks for doing that. If you have some specific questions, please note those in the chat box. We'll have a time at the end to kind of go all in with questions, a participant Q&A time. But if you have them just in time, please note those in the chat box. We'll do our best that we can to moderate those. So if I've not met you yet, my background is as a high school math teacher. In 2008, I attended the state math teacher conference and just had this aha moment of how do I change my grading practices and why do I need to do that? And so I came back and started doing it as a high school math teacher for a couple years, then transitioned to district office in Solon. I was a teacher and district office administrator there for, I think, a combined 14 years. And we led our school district through a pretty significant change, specifically our secondary schools, to work towards standards-based grading practices. So that's been my experience. Nathan and I have worked together, or we have worked together for a number of years in Solon. I'll have him introduce himself here shortly. But Nathan and I collectively have been asked by schools in Iowa and other states as well to help them take their next steps with standards-based grading. So even though I currently work in educational leadership, even though Nathan's going to share what his current role is, we're still very much involved in supporting schools in this area. So Nathan, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking time this afternoon to chat with Matt and I. Hopefully we have some time for questions too, because we know that's important to get some answers to all the things you're working on. So yeah, like Matt said, he and I have been colleagues for the last several years, worked together at Solon. I have a little bit of a unique background. I was an elementary principal and then skipped straight up to high school. So kind of seen both ends of the spectrum there. We did some standards-based work at our elementary school previous to the work we did at Solon. Last 2 years then, I've changed into a central office role. I'm currently the Associate Superintendent and Chief Academic Officer for the Linn-Mar Community School District. And we're just in the midst of rolling this out. We're calling it standards-based learning at Linn-Mar. All of our courses, 8th grade through seniors next year, will be in a standards-based format. Our middle school is already there, so when I say 8th grade, we're going to be bringing some high school courses down to the middle school. But that is our work. We're living it right now. And just like you're trying to get questions answered, I'm trying to help our own district move forward in that. So look forward to collaborating today.
In case you're wondering, that we all come from different parts of the state of Iowa. Nathan and I work together in Solon. It's a bedroom community in between Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. Nathan's currently at Linn-Mar there, just adjacent to Cedar Rapids. And obviously I work at the University of Northern Iowa in my second year in the educational leadership department. Kind of a shameless plug here. The information that we're sharing today, not all of it, but some of it stems from a book that came out less than a month ago or so through Solution Tree. And so if you're interested in really helping maybe your school team take their next steps, we believe that we have a book that can help you. So Making Grades Matter is a book that is designed for teachers, for teams of teachers that already understand why they need to change their grading practices to actually help them do it, in particular at the secondary setting. So there are some tools we're going to share today, some examples we're going to share today that come straight from this book. But there's also some information we're sharing that's beyond that. That, again, as Nathan shared, comes from our experiences. So just want to let you know that book is available. And I know there's at least 3 school districts in Iowa that are using it right now as kind of a book study format to help take their next steps forward. So our agenda today is we want to share with you just quickly what we believe are the 3 principles of standards-based grading. We're going to go quickly through that part just to unify us all together. When we say standards-based grading, my guess is in Emmitsburg, it's slightly different than North Fayette Valley, slightly different perhaps than what's going on in Newell Fonda or something along those lines. So we just want to make sure that everyone's moving forward and understanding what we believe are the 3 principles of standards-based grading. Then we want to dig into what we found are maybe the top 4 common standards-based grading implementation pitfalls. We actually did kind of an informal survey of some educators through social media, and we drew from those themes. And then at the end, as Nathan said, we want to open up for your question and answer, and I'm pretty confident we're going to have plenty of time to do that. So let's dig in here. The 3 principles of standards-based grading. We believe again, there's kind of nuances in how they're implemented, but when it comes to standards-based grading, the schools that we have seen tend to do these 3 things. First, the schools we've seen repurpose homework and any other activities such as quizzes, checks for understanding, anything that's really designed to be formative work or practice work needs to be handled that way in the grade book. The second thing is that because we believe that students learn at different rates and different paces, that students should be provided multiple opportunities to demonstrate their learning. And third, because students demonstrate their learning and because there are multiple opportunities to do it, we want to communicate that in the grade book. And the best way to do that is not through percentages. We're going to show you that it's perhaps instead related to using some type of scale, like a 1, 2, 3, 4, or other narrative descriptor of that. So let's start out first. Repurposing homework is ungraded practice. Nathan, your experience, right, as a high school principal, just tell us real quick, what were all the varying homework policies and practices that you saw before Solon High School went to standards-based grading?
Well, this probably isn't much different than what you all see in your schools at this point, too. Everything, it almost varied classroom by classroom, teacher by teacher. Thankfully at Solon, we had the benefit of some teachers piloting this idea of standards-based, and so they were dabbling in, homework is ungraded, but it ran the gamut of 0% of your grade or 5% of your grade to as many as 15 to 25% of your grade is based on your homework. And really the thing that we challenge teachers with is, if that is such essential practice, then that should happen during class. Homework is meant to be practice outside of school that kids can do with little to no support. When we place emphasis on learning so much away from the classroom, it really became an issue for our teachers. Plus, as there's just an equity piece with that. How do we know who's done it at what level? I always gave people the example, my wife's a Spanish teacher, so my kids could get perfect on their homework in Spanish all through school. Is that necessarily fair to, other situations? So that's where we really started rethinking this idea of practice and how do we implement that to where it's ungraded. So Matt's going to talk a little bit about kind of our purpose statement and how we got into, talking about what do we mean by homework and what do we mean when we say practice.
Yeah, I mean, we've all been there, right? In the conversation with the parent that says, hey, why is my kid doing so well on the homework, but they struggle on the projects, tests, or quizzes? I had a hard time reconciling that as a teacher, right? And eventually it came down to this. I assigned points for homework based upon like work completion and showing your work and things like that. It really has nothing to do with how well they understand it in my high school math classroom. That was sending a mixed message to parents who thought that anytime we got points, it was based upon how much the kid had learned. And so that was a really strong, this issue I had to figure out. So in standards-based grading, we're going away from this idea of each homework assignment being worth 5 points or homework being 15% of the final grade to instead, the purpose of homework is practice. Therefore, I'm going to report it separately, but we're still going to provide feedback on it, knowing that students are going to make mistakes. So what did I do in my classroom? I just started giving away all the answers, not half the answers, not a fourth of the answers. Here's all the answers to the practice. I want you to make mistakes and learn from them from the moment that I assign it. So you will see teachers posting all the answers to their homework on their websites, posting them in their room. I mean, that's just the way it was. The expectation was that students were to check their answers. And when they didn't understand it, they were to ask questions. Were there students who just, wrote down all the answers anyways because they're all there? Sure. But we're going to figure out real quick as teachers who's doing that, right? They're going to bomb it on the first big formative check or on the test. And so rather than just kind of playing games with kids and giving them zeros, we're just going to give them all the answers so they can get all the feedback. Okay, so hold on, right? The pushback is, but are they actually going to do it, right? Well, here's the scoop. There are 12th graders today in high schools around Iowa. Well, not right now at this moment because we're all, in the COVID-19 closures. But, a couple weeks ago, they were getting zeros, right? There were 12th graders getting zeros. And they got zeros as 11th graders and 12th and 10th graders and 9th graders and 8th graders. The zeros wasn't the fix for them. Because the bottom line is we teach amateur learners who often choose the path of least resistance. And there are students who choose not to do it when it's worth points. And there are students who are going to choose not to do it when it's not worth points. Teaching responsibility takes time. And there's actually no silver bullet for motivating students to complete homework regardless of the grading system. In fact, in our book, we have this kind of weird, funky little graph here, right? That says that the homework completion rate will actually dip when we begin to implement standards-based grading. So if you came today and said, help me, get kids to turn in homework in the midst of standards-based grading, just know there is going to be an implementation dip. There will be. That's our experience every single school. So what do? Well, one strategy is to try to create more of a feedback environment. So in my classroom, I would ask students to turn their homework in, and I'll use a traffic light strategy. Before students turn their homework in, I'd have them write a red, yellow, or green at the top. Red means I have no idea, yellow means I'm so-so, and green means I think I really get it. Then I would provide feedback to the student, and I would hand it back to them the next day, and it would just become a feedback-oriented conversation back and forth. That's a lot different than just seeing, 5 out of 5, now I'm just going to toss it in the recycle bin. Did this magically make sure every student did their homework? No, but it did honor the fact that students could make mistakes, and I want to provide them with feedback. So what about consequences, right? Typically we think about homework not getting it done, the grade being the consequence. I pulled a couple ideas from Tom Guskey's new book, Get, Set, Go. Just came out again a couple weeks ago. He said, holy smokes, let's create some consequences for students who don't do their homework. Nathan, before I get into this, Solon High School, what was the consequence for students? What did they have to do during that seminar time, opposite of lunch, if they were chronic incompleters?
Yeah, so a couple things with practice that I think are really interesting is we'd have kids, especially at Solon, for those of you that are aware of their football tradition, we'd have kids that go to practice all day, every day after school, lift every night, go to weekend workouts, and never see the football field, yet they were motivated to continue that practice. So we tried to think of the consequence at Solon High School for not doing the work was actually having to do the work. So to get to that, the bullet points there that Matt has up, one of the things we did is we just started for those chronic kids that just didn't do any work, their lunchtime became kind of what you would think of as like a mandatory study hall. We just put one of our teachers who was had his thumb on kids, but was really positive in his support as well. And he would make sure they tracked them down. If you missed a single assignment, you didn't qualify for that. This would be maybe a week or 2 weeks of no practice, no work turned in, then you were being assigned there during your lunchtime. So it was very punitive, but it was also for, the 5 to 10% of kids that just weren't doing anything at all. It gave us a response as a system. And then our teachers would communicate with that person, send that work, and they would do that during that time.
And so what we advocate for is a systematic response to students who are the chronic incompleters. And there's, again, the idea that Nathan shared several ideas from Tom Guskey's new book. That's the consequence because we want them to get the work done. Obviously, giving zeros to kids has not done that for us. If it has, we would have absolutely no kids that are seniors or juniors having zeros on their homework because the zero would have done the trick for them when they were in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. And so whatever systematic response that your school selects, we believe needs to be the consequence for students that are the chronic incompleters. The second principle of standards-based grading is providing students multiple opportunities to demonstrate their understanding. So we're going away from this idea of, well, I'm making sure that the test deadline is next Friday because that's how it is in my lesson plan book, so everyone has to learn it by next Friday. In the ideal world, would everyone learn it by next Friday? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. But the reality is that we know that students learn at different rates and different paces. And so instead, we're going to move away from this, this naive sense of everyone is going to learn it and provide a process. So we're going to tell students, if you have not yet learned Pythagorean's theorem or mitosis or cause and effects of the Civil War, that there is a process. And so we're going to talk through that in just a moment. Tom Guskey, in one of his articles, 2011, says, those who enter the profession of education must answer one basic philosophical question. Is my purpose to select talent or to develop it? If our purpose is to select talent, we're just going to assume that kids who don't get it by the deadline we set are just never going to get it. But if our purpose is really to develop talent, dare I use the phrase growth mindset, if that is our purpose in school, then we're going to do everything we can within the reporting period that we can to make sure that all kids get it. Nathan, you want to talk about the parent perspective on this? Because sometimes parents don't quite understand this. They just want their kid who learns it by the test deadline to have an advantage.
Yeah, I think for those of you that are working, through this right now in your school, this is probably, from what we've seen with schools, this is probably the single greatest hurdle, not only with parents and students, but also with staff. There are still those in our buildings that wish to have so many kids be on the one side of the bell curve and so many kids on the other. And how I think of this, and I'll always remember this, I had a parent who challenged us at a parent meeting one night, me in particular. She stood up, she was very vocal, she was really upset about this system. And she said, wait a minute, you mean to tell me you want every single kid to get an A in that class? And I stopped and I was like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we do that, we have accomplished everything. And so the hurdle with this is that we still have people, and especially our parents, that live in a society of sorting that talent. They don't want a system where a kid has an opportunity to reassess because their kid got it right last week. Why should another kid have an opportunity to reassess and get the same score as my kid? So, we have to remember our fundamental purpose as educators is not to, it doesn't say, like every student succeeds act isn't every student succeeds act by the end of the first quarter. It's we need every student to succeed. And to do that, multiple opportunities, and our second principle that comes from the book is those multiple opportunities to demonstrate learning gets to that point. But this is huge because not everybody agrees with that growth mindset. There's still a significant amount of our population that want to select and sort talent.
You got it. And just building off that, in one of Rick Wormley's articles, he says that the goal is that all students learn the content, not just the ones who can learn on this uniform timeline. And again, we're not saying that we should just give up on uniform timelines. We still are going to have that. We're not going to wait until every single kid gets it before we move on. Like, that's not where we're at. But holy smokes, if our goal, as Nathan said, is for every student to get it, we have to figure out a way within the constraints of school to help as many kids as possible get it. And, I just love this. If we really do believe that students learn at different rates and different paces, I actually worked with some pre-service educators once. They'd never even had their own classroom yet. And I asked them this question: do you believe that students learn at different rates and different paces? And every single one said yes. Like, you don't have to spend 5 minutes in a classroom and you realize this. So how can our grading practices honor that fact? Well, by providing students with multiple opportunities. So as Nathan said earlier, the penalty for not doing the work is doing the work. Here's a little flow chart that we've shared in our book. I'm just going to break it down, the top half and the bottom half. What does this all look like? Well, first of all, students are going to participate in some type of instruction, like they've always done. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to continue working with students to do some type of feedback, right? We're going to give them lots of feedback. And at some point in time, based upon our feedback and checks for understanding, we should almost be able to predict how well students are going to do on the summative, the essay, the project, the test, or whatever. And if we do a great job checking for understanding, then that's the one we say, all right, guys, I've given you tons of feedback now. Now tomorrow is the day I want to find out how well you're going to do, for sure. And that's the one that's going to go in the grade book. Sometimes we get caught up in this idea of like, how many times do we have to assess them? Here's the answer. We're going to assess them the number of times that we need to confirm that as many kids as possible get it. It's not I have to have 3 summatives and average them all together. It's not I have to have 16 summatives and use the most recent. No, it's all of the people that talk about pure, good checking for understanding practices say the purpose of checking for understanding is to inform the student where they're at and help them move forward, and to help the teacher figure out where students are at and to inform his or her instruction to change things and make students learning move forward. And so there's not a magic number. as teachers, we are going to do it. Check, 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 check. Until at some point in time, the bottom little rectangle here, students receive feedback on the assessment results, and that's the one that's going to go in the grade book. So that's kind of like the due date, right? But on the bottom part of this flow chart, what you're going to see is that, of course, some students haven't received, they still don't get it, right? We predicted, or we were wrong in our prediction, that some students still didn't get it. So then what do? Well, on one side of your screen here, you're going to see that the student can initiate a reassessment. On another side of the screen here, you're going to see that a teacher will initiate the reassessment. Depends upon the school, depends upon you as a teacher, depends upon the grade level. What we saw is that there were a lot more teacher-initiated reassessments at maybe 6th and 7th grade when compared, and definitely a lot more, right, in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, of course, when compared to high school. And there's always a process in place that students have to go through in order to have this reassessment opportunity.
How are you, Cal?
So what's this look like in practice? So Nathan, what did this look like? Let's say the student had a first attempt at a 2, and the next attempt there at a 3. At Solon, did we average them? What did that grade book actually look like when there were multiple attempts?
Yeah, there's a lot of choices here that you have for grade books. What we did was we would overwrite that grade with a new, whatever their new or most recent measure was. So as you see on the screen there, if they had a first attempt and it was a 2, we used all of our assignments were graded on a 4-point scale. So a 2 out of 4 really translated to 50%. But what we stressed to our families was that grade is written in pencil. That can be overwritten at any time. Learning does not stop once the grade is there. That was a huge piece that we had to communicate. So let's say then 3 days later, they do that reteaching piece. Now our teacher would go in and they would say, okay, now this is a 3 out of 4. They would add a note we use Power School, but most of those student reporting systems have some type of note feature. And they would say, okay, first attempt 2 out of 4, reassess. Now it was a 3 out of 4. If the student stopped there, that was fine. That was their grade. We then averaged all of those over the course of the semester, and we can get more into that in the Q&A if you want to know what that final grade calculation looks like. But what we did is we actually went in and physically changed the grade and made a note that the student reassessed that, and here is evidence of their new learning. And that could happen multiple times. I would say most kids did that once, maybe twice. We had a few kids that would do it more than twice, but when you think of the flow of your classroom, I think that's a misconception that teachers have too, is that, well, all I'm going to be doing is reassessing thousands of assignments from kids. That's really not how it plays out in practice. The kids are more selective with their reassessments.
So here's an example on the screen you can read of a Solon High School teacher down in Postal County. Very scripted, very much. Here's some criteria. Here's the process that students are going to utilize to go through the reassessment process. Later on in our presentation, we're going to share some additional examples and actually some things not to do and some things to do when creating a specific reassessment process. But we just think it's helpful to share with you a specific example of how teachers are doing it. Again, you'll see on here that Dawn says, hey, you know what? These things only take place on Tuesdays and Thursdays. There is this whole process at Solon High School where teachers had a partner teacher, and there's teachers that would request students. If you have a specific question about what that structure looks like, I recommend that you email Nathan. We'll have email addresses available at the end of this presentation. He can share with you what that looks like. Again, just like chronic homework incompleters, having a systematic response to that, we recommend that there needs to be some type of systematic process in place as well to provide time during the day for students to have these reteaching and reassessment opportunities. Just a kind of a quick, random aside. Nathan shared earlier the number of students and the number of times that reassessment took place. We can actually, as teachers, minimize the number of reassessments that take place when we do the best job that we can checking for understanding. We went through this whole process at Solon High School. We actually had a building-wide book study on the book, Checking for Understanding. I think it was by Fisher and Fry. Why? Because we were so passionate about helping teachers do a great job checking for understanding. When we do an awesome job checking for understanding, we will help more kids get it by the deadline that we set. And so if you're struggling with feeling like a lot of students need reassessments, perhaps the solution is to do an even better job checking for understanding. Last principle of standards-based grading, communicating current levels of learning in the grade book. Anyone see this hopping through the news, the social media channels about a month ago or so, this whole Kentucky thing? It was crazy. So this, just in case you didn't catch it, this Kentucky high school student on his test said, hey, you know what? I know I did really well on this test. I think I got the bonus question right. If you could you give my bonus points to whoever scores the lowest? Isn't that crazy? What does that tell us about points? Like, I've got so many points I can give them away, right? Like it's a charity exercise, or points are just, something we earn and get. They don't really measure learning. I'm not really sure what the teacher actually did with this other than, share it through social media and it went viral, but it really kind of shares with us this idea of what some people think about points is that they're just accumulation, that they're just the currency of the classroom, rather than points actually communicating students' levels of learning. So we're going away from this idea of putting chapter 3, 83% in the grade book. Why? Because when we put chapter 3, 83%, chapter 3 test 83%, it doesn't really tell us what Johnny has done well and what he needs to get better at. It just tells us 83%. Oh, and by the way, as teachers, can we honestly tell the difference between a student who got 83% and a student who got 85%? Like what is that? What's the difference in their level of learning? Oh, 2%, ha, 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 right? I get that, okay. Right? Like what's the difference? Now, Nathan, talk to us about this challenge you gave teachers once upon a time about the 100-point rubric.
Yeah, I love it. So, Matt's trying to show on the screen there, getting away from that chapter test 83%, because when we would do that, how I came up with 83% and how Matt may come up with 83% were sometimes different. So, breaking that down into those standards areas and providing a grade is more what we want to be, meaningful communication. So my challenge to teachers, because I always got a lot of pushback from this, is, but wait, I still want to use the 100-point scale. And I said, okay, I will let you use the 100-point scale, but you have to provide a descriptor for each standard for each of those steps on the 100-point scale. So if you're teaching area of a circle in our example, then I need to know what 100 is, and you need to describe that in a rubric. Then you need to do a 99 and a 98 and a 97 and so on. And so far to this point, I haven't a teacher yet take me up on that. But that's the point. When we have so many of those, it doesn't become standard. It's totally unfair and unethical, really, to use points and percentages in that way.
And so there's obviously going to be a question, right, is if we use a 1, 2, 3, 4 scale, is there some way we can create some level of objectivity, right? Because what Nathan's talking about is just this random subjectivity that happens when we try to use the 100% scale. Newsflash, there is no such thing as a purely objective way of communicating student learning. There just isn't. And so what a 1, 2, 3, 4 scale does, or a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever you want to use, what it does, it just tries to make it a little bit more objective. And if you want to talk to us more in detail, we can share with you some training that we provided teachers. We'll actually allude to a little bit later in our presentation to help them understand how to score using a 4-point scale. And here's the bottom line. Nathan and I can get more consistent as two educators in scoring on a 1, 2, 3, 4 scale than we can on a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 scale. That's just measurement theory and common sense. We'll get more inter-rater reliability on a 1, 2, 3, 4 scale than we will on a 10-point scale or 15-point scale or a 100-point scale. If you're interested in more on this topic, there's a great article by Tom Guskey called The Case Against Percentage Grades. The Case Against Percentage Grades. Wonderful, wonderful reading for you and your team if you're kind of wrestling through this idea. So we've spent the first 20 minutes or so here talking about the principles of standards-based grading. Hopefully you got a few tidbits there. But my guess, what you came for today is how to overcome some of these common standards-based grading implementation challenges. So we have 4 of them for you today. I know there's going to be some more in the Q&A at the end, but these are the 4 that we found in our little social media informal poll that educators wanted to know more about. So we're going to talk about managing the reassessment process. We're going to talk about working with colleagues to help them get on board with standards-based grading. We're going to talk about determining letter grades from standards, specifically for secondary schools. We're also going to talk about a topic that I know Nathan is super, super passionate about, and that's helping parents understand and buy into standards-based grading. So let's get started here. First, managing the reassessment process. So when it comes to managing the reassessment process, we first need to acknowledge that there's like a reality and theory here, right? Well, in theory, if kids do learn at different rates and different paces, we might allow a 35-year-old to come back and reassess his or her government scores. That's not what we're talking about here, all right? We're not talking about that. We're not talking about high school juniors coming back to do their 8th grade stuff. We're not talking about that, all right? Okay? What we're talking about is making it meaningful within the reporting period. And we're not talking about stressing out teachers in a crazy way either. We know that if you're a teacher here, your principal is saying grades are due by 4 o'clock on a certain date. We're not saying that you have to wait till 3:59 for students to turn in every single reassessment either. So we're going to talk about making it meaningful. What we came up with at Solon was a process that we felt like was somewhere more in the reality. It was this. You can set a deadline after you hand back your test or your project. So if you hand back your test, your project to students, let's say on May 1st, that you have to allow students at least 3 weeks, a minimum of 3 weeks, to enter into the reassessment process. Okay? If a student does not enter into the reassessment process within 3 weeks, their score is now cemented in ink. That's just what we did, right? Because there's some, if a student doesn't care, that's a whole different story. But if they're working through the reassessment process within those 3 weeks, you have to stick with them up until some deadline you set, maybe a week before grades are due. And so that was kind of our compromise to make things more realistic. So we said there has to be a 3-week window that you have to allow students to enter into that reassessment process. What was that reassessment process like? Well, let's first share some pitfalls. Nathan, how do we learn these? Talk to us a little bit about those piloting teachers early on. And I remember some specific meetings you had where teachers would get together, these early pilot teachers, and just share what was working and what was not. Just give us kind of a glimpse as to how we learn some of these pitfalls to avoid.
Okay, so first, a couple things with reassessments. One, I would strongly encourage your departments to come up with their own deadlines, like Matt mentioned on the previous slide, within reason. So for example, we gave some departments flexibility with that because the English teachers, and we were on a block schedule, so our year-long classes happened in a semester, but they really wanted students, if they were in week 18, they could go back and revise something from week 1. Well, that didn't necessarily work with the math team because they're so linear in their progression that having a more 2 to 3 week or a 3-week deadline for those reassessments. So I would make sure you give your department some flexibility. The other thing that we saw right away, and you can see some of those examples on the screen, is that we were building in reassessment opportunities without any relearning. A reassessment is not a, hey, just go take this again, or here's a form B, which just has some numbers and formulas changed. And so that's not what we meant by reassessment. And we had to have some type of relearning. So really all of these pitfalls come from your system needing to have a strong response to intervention, an RTI or an MTSS program. When we first started standards-based, we did not have a school-wide structure for helping kids. And actually, I think it worked out fine that way because until we had gotten into grading standards, we didn't really realize the need to have a system-wide response of interventions. Once we had that set up, we were able to avoid some of these pitfalls here. And then probably that biggest one is that first one, revising for half credit. I mean, we want that if they didn't get it, and finally the student demonstrates understanding, then that measure needs to match what you would expect for proficiency on that standard. Don't penalize them. Again, that goes back to our learning as the variable or the constant and not time. So don't penalize them for half credit if they're able to demonstrate mastery at a future point.
And don't get us wrong, if you're currently revising for half credit, that's better than not allowing anything at all. But if we really do believe that students learn at different rates and different paces, what we're working towards is allowing full credit when they do revise. So if these are the pitfalls, what are the reassessment success criteria? On an individual basis, we found that teachers just need to do a really good job of communicating what those policies and procedures are. We know that, as Nathan shared, it's probably going to vary by department and to a certain degree by teacher. And so parents wanted to know, teachers needed to know. So we had teachers posting on their website, posting it in their room, sharing it with their, their beginning of semester course syllabi or course expectations. We also, you'll see here in a moment, we required completion of any related incomplete practice as a part of it. So to kind of go back to the idea of, are students actually going to complete the practice or homework if it doesn't count towards the final grade? Well, we embed that as part of the process. So if Susie wants to reassess on
The senior this year?
on a specific, cause and effect of Civil War type of thing, if Susie did not do the practice for that, that's going to be a part of the reassessment process. Also, Nathan's mentioned this whole idea of communicating clear and meaningful deadlines. So some of our most effective teachers, I should say our most experienced teachers, because there's a lot of effective teachers, they're learning along the way, created some type of reassessment checklist for students. So you can see one on the screen here, right? And some teachers created a Google form. Other teachers had this as hard copy. They just created kind of a generic version of it here. They actually had the student write down what standard you want to reassess. Did you turn your homework or practice in before the test? Yes or no? If you did not, go back and do that and staple it to this thing. Let's set up a time to go over those corrections together. And they would put in a date or time request based upon the teacher's posted availability. They'd have to complete any extra practice that the teacher assigned. They'd also have to complete, this whole checklist back to them. And so we're not trying to create an undue burden for students here, but also just show them that it's a process to go through. Here's one from a business teacher at Solon, Jody. She was kind of creative. I knew at some point in time that she actually allowed her her students to videotape themselves explaining a concept to their grandma, mom and dad, or brother and sister. That was the flexibility that she allowed her students to do as they went through the reassessment process.
Matt, and I'll jump in here too. That's a good point. The reassessment process does not have to be another test, another quiz, another written example. Once teachers understood, like Jody's example here, that you mean I could just have a conversation with a kid and base my evidence off of that? Yes, absolutely. You are a professional evaluator of student work. If you have a conversation and you can demonstrate through that conversation that student better understands that concept, change that grade in the grade book, write that you had a student conversation, student understands the concept. That's as simple as that relearning needs to be.
And again, just to build on what Nathan said there, if you're at Casey's phone up on Saturday morning and a kid walks up to you with their reassessment done on a napkin, that's just as good as doing it in class. Also, another strategy that we found is that some teachers use a spiraling mentality. So let's say the first test was over standards 1, 2, 3, and 4. Rather than having students do some type of reassessment outside of class, the teacher would say, you know what, Frank over here needs to reassess on standard number 4. So on the next test, that's standards 5, 6, 7, on the back of that test would be stapled another opportunity for standard number 4. So students would be reassessing on stuff from the first test as a part of completing the second test. That makes sense? So some of our teachers called a spiraling method to make it just a little bit more meaningful for students to do during class, and also just to create a little bit of extra, a little bit less extra work for them outside of the class time. So we've been talking about managing the reassessment process. Let's next talk with a hot topic. If you're in a school, I'm trying to convince my colleagues to get on board. Maybe you're a principal here today trying to figure out how to get your whole school on board. Maybe you're an instructional coach tasked with working on a team to help teachers get on board. How do you help them get on board? Well, sure, this kind of a shameless plug here for our book, but what we found is that educators love feedback. As adults, we crave feedback. And sometimes the feedback we're getting is this: you're not doing standards-based grading and you need to. Well, that's not very helpful. And so what we did is we created for each of our grading principles, which we talked about earlier in this presentation, we created these continuums that said, what would it look like for a teacher if they were just getting started on this grading principle? What would it look like if they were implementing this principle? What would it look like if they were sustaining it? And so this is just an excerpt. In our book, Making Grades Matter, has an expanded version of this and actually includes evidence that teachers could provide. And the idea here is that as a teacher or as a team of teachers, we can circle where we're at along this continuum, and we can develop an action plan to help us move forward. Nathan, you want to talk about how this whole process was utilized at Solon to help the entire school move forward, ironically at different rates and different paces?
Yeah, so think about this. If you're a teacher teaching something and you have an assignment, you're going to create a rubric or performance descriptors with what you expect performance to look like on that project, standard, whatever it is you're doing. So, I would say, going back to this, and we're going to have Matt and I are going to give away a copy of this at the end. So we'll talk more about this, but our book, Making Grades Matter, and it's not to plug that, but the book offers this is probably the most valuable resource from that, because our adults just didn't know what it looked like. And I remember when Matt and I sat down and started writing this was, how can we share what it looks like in a positive way for our adult learners, that it's okay if you're getting started. Here are some things that it looks like if you're just getting started with this, all the way up to, successful implementation. Well, what does that look like? So, what's really interesting is our book got tagged with the PLC at work designation, which means Solution Tree saw a connection there with the PLC work. And so this is where that leverage point comes in. And like Matt said, each chapter provides that. Here's how we use that then, or I use that as a principle. We did two things. One, we had teams rate themselves. So like the math department or the science team. And so they would collectively fill this out as an entire department. Where do we think we're at as a team? They submitted those to me. I actually color coded it so I knew where all my teams were in their levels of implementation. And then I could adjust my leadership based on that. Later, when we had more implementation, then I had teachers do this individually so that their teammates didn't see it. But what they then submitted to me was, hey, in the math team, I've got 3 people at the full implementation level or at the sustaining level, but I have 1 person that's still at getting started, and they've been at getting started all year. So now, as my role as the instructional leadership, I dug in and helped them with that. So this tool, this rubric, the action plan that comes from this is really powerful to help those teams move forward.
So again, we suggest that if we want to help colleagues get on board, that we need to give them very specific feedback on where they're at along the implementation continuum. If you were to read an excellent article called "Starting the Conversation About Grading" by Susan Brookhart, "Starting the Conversation About Grading" by Susan Brookhart, she says that every school needs to develop grading purpose statements as the very first thing they do. And we recommend in our book that after those grading purpose statements are developed, that there needs to be some type of continuum that is used, such as this continuum you see on the screen, to support teachers as they begin to work through changing their practices. And so how do we help colleagues? We need to support them in, as Nathan said, support them as they take their next steps. Also, though, a message for the principals out there. Nathan, you want to share this message? I think there's a difference between teachers who maybe have a skill or they currently lack the skill that want to get better, and maybe teachers who have a different perspective on it.
Yeah, so principals, I hope there's some principals out there. I think I recognize some names. You can raise your virtual hands. We're not going to single you out on this, but principals, if you allow teachers, it's one thing if they don't have the skills necessary, and there's a lot of tools at your disposal that you can use to bring teams and groups forward. But if you have those resistors that are just outwardly fighting it, and they're demonstrating the will that they are not going to do this, then my question for you as principals is, why is that person still teaching in your building? And so you're going to have to use and utilize, your evaluation system in those cases. What helped us and what helped me as a principal to do that is that we had these guidelines board approved. So if a teacher wasn't doing these, they weren't following the guidelines that our school board set forth. That's easy in the evaluation sense. Now, I'm not saying that we have a lot of those teachers out there, but I hear all the time when we work with teachers how frustrated they are with this one colleague, and we all know who that person is. That's not the responsibilities of your teachers to fix that person. That's the responsibility of you as the educational leader, and you need to make sure you do everything that person either figures out those skills or they find another spot to teach if you really agree that these grading principles and purposes are what your school needs to do.
And building off what Nathan said, there's some schools I've worked with, there's a difference between, again, not believing in it and not knowing how to do it. So sometimes I've seen this idea of, well, no one's on board or not enough people on board. Sometimes it's not because they don't believe in it. They just need the support to know how to do it. And that's, again, where we suggest having some specific grading principles and creating some implementation continuum like we suggest and have in Making Grades Matter, to support teachers as they implement along the way.
Matt, I'm going to add one more thing for buildings to think about. This could be the silver lining in this pandemic, that we're all home and we're all having to rethink what education looks like. If we don't use this as an opportunity to add in those thoughts about grading, assessment, and what needs to happen, we're really going to miss an opportunity here. I mean, there's a real possibility we may not be back to school for a while. What's learning going to look like in an online environment? How do we grade that? How do we make sure that we don't start with the grading and what's this going to look like in my grade book, but rather go through the student learning? So if your school's on the verge, this time may be a time to really say, hey, we've got some things that we can use this unfortunate incident as a launch point for us to dig into some of these initiatives and make some changes in our buildings.
Spot on, Nathan. Appreciate that. So we've talked about managing the reassessment process. We've talked about working with colleagues to help them get on board. I want to talk about a secondary specific issue here, and perhaps definitely a high school issue, perhaps sometimes at the middle school as well, as how do we determine letter grades from standards? Well, here's our recommendation. If at all possible, don't do it. If you can somehow not determine letter grades, if you're at a middle school, for example, or for those of you at elementary school, don't. Just move towards reporting the standards in your report card in the grade book. I think at standards-based grading at its purest sense, that's what it would be. I think if you were to poll the high school teachers and so on, they would say that the biggest struggle they had was we still have to determine letter grades. It still seems like that's kind of against this whole idea of standards-based grading. But we were at a high school, felt like we still had to have grades, GPAs, all that crazy stuff. So how does a school go about doing that? Well, it's really a 3-step process. The first step is determining a score from a specific standard. And that really is like a whole another workshop in itself. There's, how do we determine what a 1 looks like, a 2 looks like, a 3 looks like, and a 4 looks like? And so that's a whole workshop in itself, kind of above and beyond what we're talking about today. Then the second step is to determine an end of reporting period letter grade from those final standard scores. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Then the third step, if you're at a high school that still, that still generates grade point averages, at Solon High School, that doesn't change. My guess at Linmar High School, it's not going to change how we actually determine those grade point averages. So let's spend just a few moments here talking about how to determine an end of reporting period letter grade from those final standard scores. There's 3 general methods. One is the percentages method. The reason that we share this percentages method is because it works with pretty much every electronic gradebook. In fact, this is what I call the retrofitting method here. There's pros and cons to each one of these methods. Here's what the percentages method looks like. Now, hold on here. Didn't you tell us earlier that percentages were terrible, Matt and Nathan? What are you talking about a percentages method? Hold on here. Hold on for just a second, okay? We're not using percentages we're not using percentages to get the standard score. We're just retrofitting the standard score into some percentages method to determine the letter grade. Okay, so add up all the numbers. Step 1. Step 2, divide it by the total number of standards. Step 3, use a 90, 80, 70, whatever the typical grading reporting system is in your school. So what's it look like? Just for the sake of an example, I shared a sample biology semester 1 grade book. There you see it. How would we determine a letter grade from that? Well, we just add up all the numbers, 4 plus 4 plus 3. You guys understand it. You see on the screen. And then divide it by the total number of standard scores. So there were 8 standard scores here. So there were a total of 32 standard points. And so 27 divided by 32 is 84.4%, if my math is right there. And so an 84% in most systems is a B. So again, we're not saying this is the best way to do it, but every grade book, every electronic grade book, JMC, Infinite Campus, Power School can do this. It's the retrofitting way. It's the way to do it. if you have no other way to do it. If you're a single teacher out there trying to get started with standards-based grading, you're at the 201 workshop here trying to make it happen just for your classroom, you could do this without having the district office or the IT department turn anything on or off in your world. Where there used to be a place to put in the test, you just type in a paraphrased version of the standard. That's it. Hop in here, Nathan.
Yeah, let me jump in here. So, I think this is typically probably the method that we see most often. And again, it still is dividing in a percentage. Here's why we thought we'd use that. Number one, we were still bound by grades and GPAs. So we needed to calculate a final grade. But what you don't see in this is, let's say, like, look at that protein synthesis for a 2. Maybe that student just chose to not reassess that. Maybe the plant cells that got a 4, maybe behind that student went through that concept or that standard 3 different times and finally ended at a 4. So that's why those numbers could eventually overwrite themselves into an overall percentage. And really, in this case, that protein synthesis, our teachers would have been working with that kid to say, hey, that's a 2, that could affect your grade. You might want to reassess that. But again, here, that shifts the responsibility of learning to the student, because in this case, if the student didn't, or they reassessed it 3 times and they were still the level 2 understanding, then this is where their grade is.
Spot on, Nathan. Appreciate that. So this is the percentages method. There's also a logic rule method. So same biology standards there. There is no perfect logic rule, but I just created one. To earn an A, you have to have all 4s. You just have to have all 4s to earn an A. That would be one way of determining what an A is. To earn a B, you have to have all 4s or 3s. And so you'll notice that this particular student has a 2, and so he or she has earned a C just by having 1 2 in there. Pros and cons of this one. To my knowledge, there's no electronic grade books that will do this for you. So I know of a particular teacher that's using this, and so she goes in, she creates a spreadsheet for every single kid that the students actually keep track of their grades as well. And she teaches them how to use like these count if crazy things in Excel and Google Sheets to determine that. And then she goes in like every 2 weeks and overwrites the grade based upon the logic rule in the electronic grade book. So perhaps in the future, when more electronic grade books allow this, we might see that more. But again, it's another way of doing that. If you're interested in learning more about this, recommend a great book, How to Grade for Learning, 4th edition by Ken O'Connor. He has a whole chapter in there on how to determine letter grades, and he talks about logic rules, has some more examples in there. So definitely recommend Ken's book, How to Grade for Learning, 4th edition. There's also a Marzano method. If you read any of Robert Marzano's books or Tammy Heffelbauer books, a Teacher's Guide to Standards-Based Grading, another book's called The Form of Assessment and Standards-Based Grading by Marzano. They recommend this type of method where it's like, hey, just average all of those 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s together and kind of creates a scale that looks kind of like a GPA. Also in Marzano's book, it talks about a 4 being exceeds the standard. That's a whole another topic that if you really want to talk more about, I recommend you email us, because there's people on different sides of that debate, whether a 4 should be exceeds or not. I think Nathan and I have our opinions, but it's really split depending upon who you read what that 4 should represent. Again, Bob Marzano has another method here of determining that letter grade. Last common standards-based grading implementation challenge, we're going to get to your questions here, is helping parents understand and buy into standards-based grading. So Nathan, you are, in my world, the expert on this. You want to talk about a couple different ways, maybe start off with this whole 9th grade parent orientation thing that you did.
Might help find mute. There we go. We created an activity that we had our families do at freshman orientation. So typically I would have all the freshman families come in. We had these 4 math questions. I know they're kind of hard to see on the slide there, but basically the premise of this was, we did this with the board, and we've done this with several groups, Matt and I have, but was just to see how many variables are within our current grading system. So we would have people answer these 4 questions, take 5 minutes. It's 5th grade math. Sometimes people struggled, so that was always a shock. But we would have them then switch with a partner, and they would grade this activity, and that's all the directions that we would give. And so from there, you would see a wide range of scores. Flip it over to the back, there was then a standard scale that we used. We had them regrade it, and you could see some alignment with, oh, okay, now we have a little bit more guidance in how we issue a grade. And so we tried to do that, especially when parents were so new with this. The problem is our consumers, our parents and our students, especially our parents, they're all a product for the most part of a K-12 system. So all they know is whatever happened to them when they were in school. They think they know what getting a B means or getting an A. So it's really interesting because you almost have to retrain your parents to think about school. But remember what I said earlier, they still don't quite believe that it's okay for every kid to get an A. They just want their kid to get an A. This activity helped us frame what the standards base look like.
And so you use that with ninth grade parent orientation to help them really understand how teachers are making decisions about a 1, 2, and a 3, and a 4. Nathan, do you want to talk about maybe some other conversations or helpful tips for teachers, instructional coaches, principals out there that are working with parents to help them really understand this shift?
Yeah, a couple things are going to come up. One, parents are going to point to all the problems that are currently within our system. So, they would say like, well, and I can't even think of a good example right now. The sidewalk out back is crooked, and that's because of standards-based grading. So you're going to deal with a lot of those things that don't really have anything to do with learning. The other thing is, and I go back to them being a product of the system, that makes them experts. So you have to understand that while we're trained in education, our families often think they know more than we do in those areas. So how I would do those is a lot of things, making myself available at parent-teacher conferences. We would make sure that instead of my teachers having 30 different messages to share across the building, we had one common message. We had a parent advisory group that then created some frequently asked questions. And then I used that group to help answer those questions from a parent perspective. And we published that. We had some meetings. We set that out. We also had a student advisory, and I did this initially just as we were starting. As the years go by and kids get used to it, then that becomes the norm for them, and they don't really have any issues with it. And like everything else, the adults in our system are the ones that struggle with it the most. The kids are, for the most part, the ones that can easily handle this. The one group that I would point out that I probably had the most concerns from were students who were B-level students, but they got A's because they were teacher pleasers, they did extra credit, they turned all their homework in. If the teacher said jump, they would ask how high. I mean, those kids just did everything, but they maybe didn't know the concept as well. And all those extra buffers that we put into the grade excelled them into the A category. When you shift that a little bit, we had some struggles with those kids and families because now they weren't able to overcompensate for a lack of understanding on a standard by doing other things when all of that was removed from the grade book. So, as with everything, it's not just grading any change initiative. You need to communicate.
Right on. And one of the things that we found was helpful to communicate, and actually we learned this the hard way, is we needed to do a good job, a better job, a proactive job of reminding parents what is not changing. We found ourselves trying to help them understand what is changing. We forgot to help them understand what's staying the same. So are you still, it's crazy, but are you still giving tests and projects? Some parents thought, oh, you're not doing tests anymore. No, we are. Or you're not doing projects anymore. We're only doing tests. No, we are. Are you still going to have a high school GPA? Yeah. Is there still going to be a high school transcript? Yeah. What's it going to look like? Show them. I remember a big group of parents that we were working with once. We actually had to show them, here's exactly what the transcript is going to look like. And it looks exactly the same today as it did 10 years ago. Like, oh, okay. And so, is there an expectation for teacher communication with parents? Whatever it is, if it's the same as it was before, tell parents. So as much as it is important to tell them what's changing, don't forget to help them understand what's going to stay the same. So that kind of wraps up our implementation challenges. We've got some time here. I don't know, about 15 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer. What questions do you all have that we have not yet answered? We're going to put our email addresses up here on the screen for just a moment or two. But if you have these questions, please type them in the chat box right now. And we would love to take some time to answer your questions here just in time. We can also fill some dead air if we need to here, Nathan. Nathan, here we go. All right, here's our first question. Great question. How are we preparing students for college where there might be no retakes? Great question there. Nathan, you want to take hold on here. I might even have a slide or two queued up for this one. Unbelievable. Here we go.
I think that's a great question. That's one we get a lot. Well, they don't have retakes in college, so therefore, why would we want to do that? Well, remember our goal with a standards-based system is to ensure that kids know the content and the standards for all of our requirements. And by doing that in a standards-based way, we actually see kids take more ownership for their learning. For example, we could go back to that slide and the one kid in biology that didn't know those plant cells. Hopefully, we have translated skills to them that when they go to college, they know how to access information, they know how to relearn things, they know how to go back and identify with themselves as a college learner that, hey, I'm not good at this. Here are some things I need to do before my assessment, because obviously I'm not going to have a shot at redoing that. The other thing that we did in our system is we maintained a midterm and a final. We always had a midterm test and a final test that were part of their grade. You can't reassess so that they could still feel what that felt like. I always jokingly say, if we wanted to do it like college, I'd put all the kids in front of my best biology teacher with 150 sophomores in the gym and let her teach, and they take a test at the end of the semester. We know that college is a lot different. We want our kids to have the skills so that they can identify their strengths and weaknesses prior to going to college. Our anecdotal, we don't have a lot of this in hard data, but our anecdotal stuff from our college kids is that standards-based was very helpful for them so that they knew what their strengths were and what they weren't. They, just like any other person in any system, when the speed limit changes from 55 to 70, they will adjust in college when they know they can't retake. That's just, the kids will handle that.
You know, as a college professor, I feel like I can speak to that specifically, Nathan. I mean, there are professors that have homework that counts towards points in college, and there are professors that don't. There are professors that have a midterm and final only in college, and there are professors with midterm, final, plus 3 tests. I mean, it's just all across the board. Not to mention, I feel like I can say this as well, there are a number of poor pedagogical and assessment practices that are frequently found in higher education. Let's be honest, right? We've all been through college as licensed teachers, and our goal should not be to replicate those poor pedagogical and assessment practices in our K-12 settings. And Nathan alluded to that.
Matt, here's another one. How do you handle students who do not want or absolutely refuse to take the retake? That's a little bit different by level. So our middle school that was standards-based would require, if you were under a 2 or below, you had to retake. And that was just, they built that in as part of their regular instruction. At the high school, really, if a student refused to retake, then that learning is really on them. So the parent can't blame the teacher that, hey, you failed my kid, when we could easily show your kid didn't take any advantage of these retake or reassessment opportunities. So we tried to handle those at the high school on a case-by-case basis, but sometimes that power was with the student, especially at the secondary level, that, hey, if I don't want to retake, I can't make you, but you have a process and a reassessment policy if you choose to use it as a student.
Spot on, Nathan. And let's be honest as well right now, like there are students who refuse to do the work in a traditional grading system. And so we have to figure out a way to handle those situations as well. And there's no silver bullet to that. Question here from Stacy. Should students have open-ended time limits to complete reassessments or make-up work? It was mentioned a minimum of 3 weeks. Stacy, I agree with you. I believe they should have unlimited amounts. And when I was a high school math teacher, I erred on that end. But we also realized that that can create some management struggles for teachers. It can also create some management struggles for students. And so what we did is we came up with this minimum of 3 weeks that they have to do it. And then we allowed teachers and departments, teams to expand upon that. Again, if it's possible, if grades are due at 4:00 on June 2nd, let's allow every kid to reassess until 3:59, right? It's just impossible to get them all graded in that amount of time. And so that's why we had some type of compromise in there as a guiding principle. Nathan, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's a good question. I would leave that up to departments. I will add the one thing that Linmar is going to do differently is we are setting up our grade book to where if a student did not demonstrate any mastery learning or anything like that on a standard, it's going to automatically default to an incomplete, and that student would have to attempt that before that course ends or extends past that course at the discretion of the teacher. So sometimes those time limits for reassessments, again, I would encourage you to work within your building and your departments to come up with those and then have a collective discussion about that as a staff.
Excellent. Trevor, with another wonderful, wonderful question here. Thank you, Trevor. How important do you think feedback is when it comes to standards-based grading? Any thoughts on how to make sure that this is being done well in your school? Trevor, I think it is of the utmost importance. And when I say that the most important part of standards-based grading is checking for understanding, I'm also including feedback as a part of that process. There's just some really great books and articles out there. Again, the book being Checking for Understanding, I believe it's by Fisher and Fry. I believe there's another book called How to Give Effective Feedback to Your Students. That might be another book that's worth considering. The better feedback we give to students on practice assignments, the better feedback we give to students on those checks for understanding, the mid-unit quiz, the end of class exit ticket, all those things we do to check for understanding, the better job we do with that, the better that students are going to be informed of where they need to go next. And the better they're informed of where they need to go next, the better they're going to do on the assessment that's going to be broken down into standards and go in the grade book. And the fewer reassessments we're going to have. And ultimately, more of those students are going to learn at a high level, which is what we all go into education for, is to see our students be successful. So I'd recommend, doing a book study on some of those books. Trevor, if you'd like, you can email me. I can give you some specific articles if you want to save the bucks and not buy the books. I've got some short reads for you as well.
Matt, I'll take that next one. What happens when you're close to the end of a grading period? Great question. We cut reassessments off the last week of the quarter or semester. Now, typically, because most of our classes were semester, our quarter classes, that wasn't a huge issue for. But we did set and we communicated it, no reassessments past this date. That way the teacher has a week to collect everything and get that submitted for a final grade.
Excellent. Another question here from Alan. Alan, if a student is not successful on the assessment and has not done the practice, is it acceptable to use the practice as requirements before they reassess? Yes, definitely, we would say so. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's why we built that back in through there. And I would say that's the most frequent route kids will do is they'll do poorly on an assessment. And the teacher will say, hey, did you do your practice work? Kid's like, no. Then you go do your practice work and come back and see me after that for your reassessment opportunities. So yes, absolutely.
I'd say, Alan, any good reassessment process would 100% incorporate that into it. Excellent, excellent question. We've got time for a couple more here.
Matt, what would you recommend as next steps? We're all kind of in this weird, homebound setting. We've got a lot of teachers on here. I don't know how many are in their teams or if they're just individuals. So, what would you recommend to people be after today? What should I do? Number one, if I'm a teacher, if I'm a principal, what does that look like?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, I think right now is just a wonderful time to start up, perhaps as I alluded to there with Alan, is to start up just some informal conversations, reading some articles, pulling a chapter from a book, and to just talk about that. So I think some of us have extra time, some of us don't. I realize that too, but if there is some extra time in your schedule right now, is that time to hop on FaceTime or hop on Zoom and to have some of those informal conversations. Another thing I think is really helpful is that in some of our schools, at least some of the schools I've seen, the learning that we're pushing out, whether it's synchronous through Zoom or asynchronous maybe through Google Classroom, is that this stuff is optional for kids. Yet at the same time, it's a really great opportunity for us to practice giving them really, really, really good feedback and not attaching a grade to it, right? And so I think we're at just John's shaking his head right now. We're just at this prime time to practice these ideas that we've always wanted to do, and just see how it works, right? And ask some students, how helpful was this feedback for you? Maybe try giving feedback in some different ways and see what's most helpful in the eyes of students. I think that's a really great next step. A final step I'd recommend is if your school already has, or if your pilot team already has some grading principles that you have developed, I would recommend creating some type of continuum of what that looks like. What's it mean for a teacher to just get started? What's it mean for a student or a teacher to be doing it or to do it at a high level? You don't have to use our books resources. You can create this on your own based upon what you've read or what you know, and start creating some of those implementation checklists, those implementation continuums to support teachers, to support each other in taking their next steps. We'll put that question back on you, Nathan. What do you think that the educators here in the room could do during this potential downtime to take some next steps from this webinar and the unfortunate crisis that we're in?
Yeah, I agree. And like I said earlier, it is a crisis and it's unprecedented for us as educators, but we absolutely have permission now with school just being, brought to a halt, to recreate it in the image that we want that's best for kids. And so, I would just take one action step back to your teams. If anything, I would recommend getting if you can't get your district to do it at the board level or your principal to do it at the building level, then at least as a department, come up with some grading guidelines, some of those practices. Here's how we're going to reassess. Here's what homework means if I'm in a science team, and formalize that stuff so that all of you in a PLC or on your team have that in your syllabus and you're all working from a standards-based approach within your department. I think that you can do, and if you start that, you'll see that can easily continue, because that's how it worked in Solon with Matt leading that charge as a teacher. Easily continues throughout and bleeds into the rest of the staff.
All right, Nathan, we got close to 70 people that have stuck around over an hour. I think everyone's either A, interested in what we're saying, or B, just sticking around because they want a chance to win that book you talked about earlier.
Yeah, so I just put in our chat. Matt, can I see if I can share my screen real quick?
You bet. Fire away, man. Are you issuing a challenge here? Is that what you're doing?
Well, yeah, I'm going to kind of get creative here. We'll see what this looks like. Hopefully everybody can see.
Lori, I think Power School, Power Teacher Pro is perhaps the grade book that Solon's using. Do you guys use that at Linmar too, Power School? Nathan?
Yeah, we're using Power School. So,
all right.
So here's our thing. And like I said, I'd love to give away 2 of our books. If you go we have a separate Twitter account. Obviously, Matt and I both have our own, and you've probably seen us on there. But Grades Matter SBG. If you just go on there today and maybe share a little nugget of what you've learned and follow us on our Twitter account for our book, Matt and I will select 2 people here before the end of the week. We'll just select those randomly, and we'll private message you, direct message you, and we'll send out a free copy of that resource. So I put that in the chat. You should be able to see that, Grades Matter SBG. So give us a follow, and we'll send out a couple free copies. How's that sound, Matt?
Sounds awesome. I see a kind of a blank screen. Do you have something else you want to share there, Nathan, at the end?
Oh, no, can you see
No,
I was just showing our Twitter page. Does that show up?
Not yet. Try resharing there, perhaps.
Yeah, I've got, there, now is it?
Not yet.
No, I've got 3 different screens open with my monitor, so I may not be able to pull that up, but I've got a link in there in the notes. So
perfect. All right, awesome. Awesome. Thanks so much for everyone coming out this afternoon. We are going to post this recording. If there's any way we can help you out, whether it's just a quick phone call, an email, you have our contact information. We'd love to stay in touch with you. Thanks again for taking some time out of your afternoon to be here today, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.